Hello, and welcome to another episode of the William Branham Historical Research Podcast. I'm your host, John Collins, the author and founder of William Branham Historical Research at william-branham.org, and with me I have my very special guest, Awen Dunning, advocate for former members of IHOP. Awen, it's so good to have you on here. We have chatted for, I don't know how many weeks, it's probably months now after the scandal broke at IHOP, and you and I have been sort of connecting all of the pieces of the puzzle. In our historical podcast, Charles and I had discussed the history of how Branhamism became the Kansas City Fellowship, Kansas City Prophets, etc. We didn't really go too deep with that, and most of my research personally had stopped around 1970-ish. So Charles had much of that research, and I'm just now diving into that. So it was so good to connect with you and to get some of the history from the inside of, some of what's going on. I had no idea, but you've given me so many pieces to the puzzle. I think I'm up to 200 approximately research requests and some of the things that you've sent me of additions that I have to put on my website, which I'm currently going through. But anyway, welcome, and maybe you could tell everyone a little bit about yourself.
Well, thanks for having me. Yeah, so, it's been a long time since I personally bumped up with IHOP, about 23 years, actually. So very early on, we moved on without offense or bitterness, didn't leave because of, anything that went on. But man, a lot has happened in 25 years over there. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's quite an unusual history. I think just last night, I had started putting the final pieces on my article for the angel, the alleged quote-unquote angel that was supposed to have came down on the scene and created the Kansas City Prophets. And it was it was a bit comical for me because I remember years ago, my family escaped in January of 2012 from the Branhamism cult. And one of the first things that I did was examine the angel, because Branham claimed that there was an angel on the platform with him everywhere he went. And he would talk to this angel. He would even pray to this angel as if the angel was Jesus. And in some cases, he said the angel was Jesus. So I started lining up every single thing that was said about this angel, and it's like a ping pong ball bouncing in a room filled with mousetraps because sometimes the angel's Jesus, sometimes he's got a turban, sometimes he's got a beard, sometimes clean shaven, all of these different variations of the quote-unquote angel, none of which can really go together. And I started examining this angel Emma that they called, and you had given me this research, and it's just unbelievable. They continued the same story from Branhamism into IHOP through Paul Cain, Branham's protege, and the same story but with a different name.
Yeah, I mean, you hear these stories when you're really young and you haven't established critical thinking, I guess, or maturity enough. And so this indoctrination happens, and it seems perfectly normal that all of these things are happening. And I think it's done quite sneaky. Paul Cain never said from the stage, I have an angel standing next to me. But what happened is a very well-known international speaker, who shall not be named, he'll go and tell 100 people, don't tell anybody. And then everybody knows, because of course everybody tells 15 people, and then millions of people know that Paul Cain is on a stage and an angel talks to him. So, Bob Jones was the one that created this Emma persona, if you will, this angel. And then it became very in vogue that if anybody wanted to have a stage or, be the next prophet of apostle or whatever, they would have good old Emma show up, and she was something.
Yeah, the Emma story is quite unusual, but as you and I have been communicating through emails back and forth, I was a little surprised at how much of Branhamism was carried forward into this movement. Obviously, if you take the two groups of people and compare them from the surface, you're going to say that these are two different groups of people, two different ideologies, etc. But that's just the physical appearance, right? Because the Branham cult is stuck in the 1950s. They want the 50s hairstyles, dress code, Pentecostal, holiness, etc. And then IHOP has progressed from that visually when you look at them. But you get down to the underlying framework. You've got the manifested sons of God. You've got Joel's army. You've got all of the things that William Branham either created or helped create along with other men, carried forward into this through Paul Cain and others. And like I said, I was just really surprised to see the similarities between all of this.
Yeah. I mean, you have to remember that, for the people that spoke into our lives, I mean, we by and large get our doctrines and indoctrination from the guys with the microphones, right? A couple of women. And, we are fed this steady diet of God's generals and all these great men of faith. And so revivalism is a really big thing. And there's this constant grandstanding and staging of these people who have gone before us and, the mantle of this person and that person. And so Branham was this person who, as it was disclosed to us, was this thing to attain to, and thousands and thousands and thousands of healings and, all these types of things. And he went off a little bit at the end, and so that's what you believe. And, we hold John G. Lake and all of these guys in this high esteem. And somebody actually sent me your link because, we're all passing it around right now. And I just powered through. I mean, I think I listened to over 110 of those things in a short period of time. And, I'm just in my house walking around listening. And I'm like, it's like it's the same world superimposed, just modernized. The number of things, encounters, stage personas, doctrines, forerunner, all this different thing. And I just thought, the main leader, in this movement is very, very similar actually to William Branham. And you can see the key players in all these different movements. And it was almost like free falling for a while. I'm like, don't take all of our heroes, and, but it's very settling at the end, because what I really feel like is you see all this rot, you see authoritarian control, you see what these offices of prophets and apostles do, and the abuse and the lack of critical thinking. And you see rotten fruit, and then you start tracing it up the branch, and then you go down to the root, and you see that it all makes sense. Like everything snaps together, and you begin to realize that you have been programmed, that you've been indoctrinated, and you have these abusive scenarios, and you leave somewhere and you go find yourself in another one and another one, because you just think, oh, this is a bad person. This is an anointed person or godly person that just was tempted, by Satan and they fell or something, not recognizing that it's an ecosystem of abuse and hierarchy and power and control, and quite tainted. Of course, there's really good people in there. There's really good people trying to serve. There's a lot of people doing the best that they can with what they have. But it is system-wide that there is rot.
Absolutely. It's, I get accused a lot of being a Pentecostal hater. And because my website, if you type in any person on my website, you're going to find all the critical information. And yet there were, like you said, some really good people mixed in with the bad. And what I have tried to do on my website and through my podcast is just basically create a counterbalance to the God's generals nonsense. If you read through some of those stories, it's like they have purposefully avoided all of the bad things and only published the good. So I thought, well, why not just do the same thing from the opposite side on my website? But there are some really good people in it. And it reminds me, I don't know if you've played this game, but my family has this game called Jenga, where you've got these blocks and you pull a block out and you stack it on top. Well, in my set, we've played it so much, there's this one block that is just really, really bad. And if it's at the bottom and everything gets built on top of it, that one block is going to cause the whole thing to crumble. And so you want to, as you're playing, you want to make sure that that block gets moved higher and higher as you go. Well, it's like these men knew some of these bad guys were involved, but didn't take the bad block out. Instead, they just built their stack on top of it. And the problem with this is they built theology and called that theology a movement, quote, inspired by God, but they're building on a very bad thing. And the moment in which that bad thing gets exposed, or like you said, there's abuse and all kinds of other bad fruit, the moment in which the bad fruit traces back to that, they just leave it there and keep building on top of it.
Yeah. There's this narrative to redeem everything. There's this, well-known international leader right now that's facing multiple allegations and, very credible accusations. And, there's people that are like, let's keep the prophetic history. Let's, dig through his teachings and find, the redemptive things. And it's like, why would you go to a dirty cistern and, take buckets of water out of that thing and keep drinking it? It's like, move over to a well, that's clean water. And so that's some of the things that were very similar to me in terms of, you talk about Branham, how he created a stage persona. We very much have that in this world, especially with this particular leader, this David persona, this prophetic history of, 12 hours of, mandatory listening for people. I've heard it. I could tell you a lot of it in story form, 12 hours of it. And I haven't listened to it for 20 something years. And so it's, audible voice of God and, archangel encounters, with Archangel Michael and, going to heaven and all these things. And it's like, how do you argue with that? Right. When the God card is thrown. And so it pulls people into this narrative where they're living and giving themselves unto the story that is, so much bigger than themselves. And, like I said earlier, there's a lot that has really gone downhill since I've been there. When I began talking to folks, because I've been so far removed from it for so long, I honestly thought at first, surely they're exaggerating a little bit. Just your own mind can't comprehend some of the things that they're saying because, there were checks and balances at place when I was at Metro, which was, the church that was originally founded before IHOP KC happened. And it was okay to have different views on eschatology in terms of how is the world going to end? There was a, governing board. There were people that could bring accountability. And then when, folks leave and start this thing, there's no checks and balances. And there's one way that it's going to be, and it's doomsday prophecy. It's this group of people that have to live this aesthetic lifestyle. They've got to pray enough, fast enough, perfect enough. And it is their job to release the judgments of God on the earth through prayer and worship, that they're going to break seals and trumpets and, all the things. And it is their job to actually call back the return of the Lord. And when he comes back, he is not happy. He is going to slice off the heads with swords of heads of state. And his, righteous ones are going to join with him and exact vengeance and destruction and death on the earth. I can't even imagine being a teenager and sitting under hours and hours and hours of this type of what I'm going to call psychological abuse and fear and, race wars and rapes and, mothers need to prepare themselves by picturing their children being martyred in advance. And the number of people that have left that place that experience labor abuses, working 60, 80 hours a week without food, living in poverty, living, 10 people in a home, somebody's bedroom is a closet in somebody else's, bedroom, living on, porches. You look at this mass destruction and you just, I never had the ability to trace it back to where it came from. And I have been able to do it in the last 6 months.
And it's a lot of work to do that. I can say that from experience. It's what's really weird is it is Branhamism 2.0 when you really take it down to its basic elements. I grew up, Branhamism, he died in 1965, and the cult is stuck in this mindset of the 50s and 60s. So I grew up with the communist scare of the 50s and 60s. That's how we were trained and indoctrinated. I was told that the Russians would come over and they would rape the women on the shores, and they would basically the Fox Book of Martyrs was a nice propaganda book that they used to recommend that we read, but they said that will happen again to the Christians. And I was raised with stories how they would tie the arms and legs to two elephants and just rip people apart. And my own mother told me it was a curse to be beautiful because you'd be one of the first women that would be raped by the Russians. And then, the rapture theology has changed between Branhamism and what's coming out of IHOP. But in Branham's version, then we would come back and we would be the ones to slice off the heads. Branham would use the word judge, but he would also mingle that phrase with cannon fodder, etc., and talk about how, there would be a race war. There would be all of these things that you're talking about. There would be a super race that we were part of, and we would come back and quote unquote judge the bad guys of Christianity and non-Christianity. So I grew up with all of this.
Right.
And the problem for it, like you said, it is abuse. It's psychological abuse. We've linked it to Nixon. It was psychological warfare that Nixon was telling the full gospel businessmen to enact in their meetings. And to learn that this comes through to IHOP is just unbelievable. To break the ice for all the listeners, because everybody knows who we're talking about, we're talking specifically about the allegations against Mike Bickle. And I'm no attorney. I have no idea whether he did or did not do the things that was said. I will give my opinion, no legal judgment whatsoever, because that's his business, not mine. But we're discussing our opinion of Mike Bickle, and to clear the air, that is who we're talking about.
Might be helpful just to share a little bit of my journey and story with him. Strangely enough, I don't know if I told you this, but, through listening to your whole podcast, I recognized and realized that my mom was raised in a splinter group of the Message. And that is a whole story where, she, fled at 18 years old and was very much not raised in the church. I have a, salvation experience and immediately come to Mike Bickle's church and did a discipleship program, left for 2 years, came back to do an internship at a ministry that was, under their covering. It was a ministry that was founded out of Metro. And, Mike was this larger than life person who lived this radical lifestyle, unlike anything I had ever seen. And all I knew was that I wanted to be that, to think like that, to act like that. Like there was power to be had, because I guess God, likes that. And he loves, this radical intimacy, and the way to get that and to get these, deep revelation that no one else could get, that meant this very fasted lifestyle of hours of prayer and going without food and, getting oil and all of these stories. And so he began coming into our ministry and showing a lot of attention there. Right after that, I got an invitation from Jane Doe 1 to begin spending time, the three of us together. And we spent hours together. I thought that it was this divine favor on my life at the time of, this international leader who knows millions of people, that he would focus in on us and spend hours with us, discipling us, answering our questions, mentoring us into the, deep things of God, introducing us to bridal mysticism, the mystics. But what was happening was that I had a front row seat to the premeditated, detailed, thought out, grooming of one of my best friends. And, allegedly you can look at all the articles that, Julie Royce has put out and others, and you can see, where that story is. But, she ended up in an apartment alone, isolated, her eating controlled, her time controlled, who she could talk to, who she could not. And, according to those stories, she was told that his wife was going to die, and God had told him that she would be his future wife. This is not the only woman who experienced this story.
It's just incredible, the things that the Jane Does are saying. And I mean, anybody who wants to look it up, you can look up the news. It's my opinion. It's not, we're saying that he actually did these things, but there are enough people that if you take the biblical mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, what is said by the witnesses is substantial, and the things that are being done. But for me, it's even more problematic when you trace it back through the history, because this is nothing new in this movement. You can trace it back and you can see entire groups of young men being groomed for far worse than even what Mike Bickle has been doing. And it was all swept under the rug, under the Branhamism. And my grandfather probably knew, I can't say for sure that he did, but there were a lot of people in leadership that knew these things were going on. And I came to know at least 5 major instances so far where there were serious crimes being committed, and I can identify the names of people who knew it, but they covered it up. And then what happened is people like Paul Cain, who is, until his death, he was still a Branham message believer. I have there's a video clip, I think I've got it on my website, but you can see him right before his death saying that we need to let the people know who William Branham truly was. And he's saying this to the leader, I think it's of Daystar, one of the NAR organizations. But these men were Branhamites through and through, and many of them, such as Paul Cain, knew exactly the things that were going on, swept it under the rug, and then allowed it to continue. And we're seeing today the fruits of what happened by letting it continue.
Absolutely. You or Charles made a statement one time that you said, blackmail is the mutual glue that holds this thing together. And I will say, absolutely, it's true. There's a whole lot more going on than what the public even knows. I mean, it's a small percentage of the story, and it feels like a lot already of what's going on. And, certainly people didn't know, but certainly people have known. And, one leader within this thing called it the golden ticket. If you knew what was going on, you had the golden ticket because you had job security and favor and everything else. And so what they're doing in the name of Jesus, sometimes it'll keep you up at night.
I have spoken with other members of splinter groups who have escaped, who are in high-ranking positions, and it's not just the dirt that they have on one another in leadership. One person in particular knew exactly where the file cabinets were, that they had actual big files on people who were just lay members of the church, people who were filling the pews, and they had information about them, and they wanted that information because they've got the quote-unquote discernment or the spiritual insight from angels or visions or whatnot, and they can say, I know that you did X, Y, and Z. Well, they've got a file on it already, and they know that these people did X, Y, and Z. One person who escaped told me that it was so blatantly obvious because this person had published something that was happening in their life on Facebook, and the quote-unquote prophet came out and said, now God has given me a vision that you have done exactly what you just posted on Facebook. And so they're like, I'm out. This guy's a fruitcake, and they left. But they do the same thing among leaders, because there's a lot of power in holding one of those files over somebody's head and saying, if you step out of line and I start losing money because you're stepping out of line, everything I have in this file cabinet is going public.
Yeah, we have a little more digital version of those things going on, but I can assure you those things are going on. What's interesting to me is when, let's just talk about Paul Cain for a second. So there's this folklore, right, that was around him, and he's got an angel that talks directly to him. You're trying to conceptualize what that would even be like, to have this a being giving him secret information, from heaven. And he used to do awful things like call out people's sins and who were having affairs and rebuke people publicly, and then he came into this time of repentance over that, and it was only going to be good things. And so, you watch him work this room. And of course, you think it's all real at the time. So, he's getting names or middle names or birth dates or addresses. And, it's maybe 10 different people who, get a word, and everybody's on the edge of their seat hoping it's them. And it kind of works like 2 pieces of information nobody else would know, and then something, big about, that's going to happen in their life. And it's always these big grandiose things, revival in Seattle, or, birthing apostles, or, something very narcissistic typically. And so, what happened actually to me when I was 22 was I signed up for this conference that was at Metro, which was Mike's church. And I ended up getting called out of town to go preach. So when I return, I am told, you got a word from Paul Cain. Now, the interesting part about this story is that, I have no proof of this, but I had sat down with Mike Bickle, and I had told him a couple of things about my childhood. And I had told him I had a dream to have a ministry like Jackie Pullinger. And what do you know? This word from Paul Cain is a couple of things from my childhood. You have a dream to have a ministry like Jackie Pullinger. You will have this. And then the next part is, I'm not giving you a controlling word, but you'll have a heart of singleness. And it's this whole thing of kind of setting the stage for this conversation about being set aside as celibate, which is a very big deal within this movement. There's this, aesthetic, like this extra call for those who will do extended seasons of consecration or celibacy. And, the backstory on that is that there's actually a lot of abuse that happens in those scenarios when you can isolate people into those places, living alone, etc. So what happens is, we end up having all of these conversations around celibacy because of this word that I was given. And I ended up leaving Kansas City, going away. Interestingly enough, the celibacy thing didn't take. 17 months later, I returned with a husband, and I end up, years go by, and of course, this word never comes to fruition. And I have children. I don't want a ministry like Jackie Pullinger. I don't want to go take my children and live with triad gang members and in opium dens. But this thing settles over your life with this expectation. And I never once in a million years have I ever doubted marrying my husband or the life that we have had together. I've done everything that I could ever do to follow God. And what it led me into was being a mom and starting and running businesses. But I always had this thing around me that I needed to live this really big life and kind of make up for this thing that I never allowed God to do in my life. And years pass, and I struggle with disappointment and disillusionment and dread over this thing. And what do you know? We end up becoming very dear friends with the person who was Paul Cain's assistant. He's now passed. And we get discussing this around a fire one night, and he begins to tell me that Paul manufactured a lot of his prophetic words. And I find out over the course of time through different folks that knew Paul very well that he had dozens of phone books in his garage. And for 3 or 4 days before an event, he'd get a list of names of people that were going to be there to pray over them and hear from the Lord. And he would disappear, lock the door with those phone books, etc. And he would also get fed information from folks so that he could go up and do his stage show. And it was, I'm embarrassed to say, about 10 years ago only that I found out that this word was manufactured. And not only, are these things to create the big show, create the razzle dazzle and get everybody all excited. For me in that situation, it is my opinion that it was a setup to have conversations around the concept of extended seasons of consecration and coming in and being a worker clone or drone within the house of prayer.
I grew up in the occult royalty, I call it. I was in the upper tier of the pyramid structure of occult, my grandfather being the pastor of the Branham Tabernacle. I got to witness a lot of things that people didn't, and at the time, I really didn't think through it. It wasn't until after I left and started deprogramming and realizing that, no, manipulating people's minds is probably a bad thing. But I grew up in the upper echelons where you could see this happening. You could, one of the tactics they use is they will get somebody's guard down. They'll open up as a very friendly conversation, get them to turn off critical thought, and then use suggestion to suggest that there's some spiritual insight. And the eyes get big of the people they're talking to, and they, they can wreak havoc with their minds. They can do whatever they want. Paul Cain called me, and see, I grew up like this, and when people tried to do it to me, I would always fight it off. I would either play naive, which I'm actually very good at doing, or I would just turn it back at them. So whenever they're trying to play this game with me, I just don't play the game. I throw it back in their face. Well, Paul Cain called me and did this, and I really didn't think about it while he was talking to me. It wasn't until after, we had a few conversations. It wasn't until after that I realized, wait a minute, he was trying to do this to me. I think he was trying to give me some sort of spiritual insight on what he wanted me to do. And especially now that you combine this with his instructions to, I think it's Chris Reed, that he's saying we need to go help show who William Branham truly is, right? It was about that same time frame that Paul Cain was calling me. And I'm so used to it, I just played naive. And he started talking and doing his thing to get in my head. And he was clearly frustrated at how naive I was. But then I would turn it around with a question. And my questions, you can't see it, but I've got 4, 5, sometimes 6 monitors going at the same time. So I've got information while I'm talking to people, and I can look things up. It's like the Bat computer, right? Well, as he's talking to me and I've got all this information up, I can pull up questions that I can ask him, whatever I want. And one of the things I had up was his article where he did the apology over his drunkenness, his sexual immorality, etc. And I just asked him about it and threw him totally off balance to the extent he actually denied and rejected all of it. He said, no, that never happened to me. I was never like that. And I'm looking at his apology, right? So I threw him off balance, but I was able to get some good insights, not all of which I have yet publicly said, but he clearly was a Branhamite through and through, and he clearly had mastered the techniques that were done by the leaders, my grandfather included. Grandpa was good at manipulating the heads. I watched him do it. But it's so wrong when you think about doing this to a person. And, I'm trying to put myself in your shoes. If you were under that and they were trying to groom you, we don't know what was going on, but say that was the case, I can't imagine what it would be like to be in that position.
Boy, there's a lot of words that could be used right now. There's a swirl and a confusion. It's evil. It is evil to make up prophetic words. It is not the first time I've seen it happen. I was in a ministry, that actually was, the one that was under Metro, where prophetic words were made up to control folks. And so, nothing surprises me, but it's interesting how long it takes to kind of deprogram to the point where you recognize and realize things for what it is. But I can assure you the stories about Paul Cain are much worse than the public knows. There are more survivors than most folks know. It is a very deep and dark hole. And those that knew for very long periods of time what was going on and allowed it to happen, because there's a lot of mutual gain that happens when those things go on. Paul he would not do his little show, the prophetic stuff, unless he was allowed to preach. And, it was interesting to me because I didn't know him, early on, right? I mean, I think the first time I ever heard him speak would have been like 94. And he rambled and he babbled. It was very hard to follow, come to find out he was very drunk. But it was always, Joel 2, And it was always, stadiums filled, and then, these stories of working with, the government or CIA or this or that. And so you're, the whole time you're just trying to put it all together. But a lot of these other prophetic grifters, they actually are a little more sophisticated and put together than that. And what's diabolical about it is that they do preach with it. So you have these, very emotional, worship experiences that kind of prepares the place, and all this anticipation and lore that's going on about, who it is that's about to whatever. So they give all of these prophetic words, and, like you said, the guards just go down. But what happens is these same men, and sometimes women, that hold these microphones, you're so vulnerable and open. And what they do is the heresies start coming, and the views and the thoughts, because of course this certain man of God has this special link to heaven, and all these encounters, maybe Elijah himself is visiting him, and, the cloud of witnesses are, giving him insights from heaven or something. And you're taking in hook, line, and sinker these teachings that are actually Gnosticism, that are false teachings, that really have nothing to do with the cross of Jesus Christ. And it begins leaking. And so it's a very, it's the show, it gets the money, it gets, the people excited and hitting the feeder bar and showing up. But it also introduces these very dangerous thoughts and beliefs that causes just so much havoc. So it's a very tricky, sinister show.
It is. In the Joel 2, everybody who's familiar with our Manifest Sons of God research, this is the Joel's army. This is the manifestation of the sons of God. This was the framework for what William Branham used to empower leaders to wreak havoc with the minds of others. And Paul Cain was very open about his work with CIA, FBI, these government entities. He was also very open that William Branham is the one who sent him to Germany, and he was proud of this fact. In fact, he mentioned it on two of the phone calls that I had with him. He mentioned that he was the proxy that Branham sent to Germany. And at that time, I was unaware of the whole Colonia Dignidad research. I don't know if you've studied that yet or not, but
very much, yes.
It's unbelievable. And when you consider the exact nature of Paul Cain's crimes and compare that to what was going on with the boys in Colonia Dignidad, it raises a lot of questions. It really does. And again, these men, they love blackmail to each other, the leadership. You have to wonder how much Paul Cain confided in the other leaders about what had happened and what was currently going on, if I remember the history correct. Because these men would have known, at least to some limited extent, what Paul Cain was talking about. I had no idea because I'd never heard the name Colonia Dignidad, but you go back in the era in which he's setting up the Kansas City Prophets, you had big news reports coming out of Chile that had made international news up into Canada sometimes. So there had to be some element of knowledge being passed around. But we may never know how far that goes and what they all knew.
For sure. I will say that, in our movement, in terms of, what those teachings ended up doing was, we certainly had the hierarchy, the offices. As a side note, I believe, like the early church folks, first century church, that there are gifts. I think that they are to serve one another. We're to submit one to another, that this top-down hierarchy, abuse of power thing is a no. I don't find it anywhere. I don't know how, I guess we know how we got here. But I see these teachings, we go back to Alice Bailey, we go back to Jane Lead, very, very dangerous, very evil stuff that was plagiarized and melded into the church. But it's like a virus. And I see that, from Branham down through Cain, down through, Bob Jones and others, it's mutated. So you can look at these different camps and you can see, oh, this is what the mutation ended up looking like here. This is what the mutation, ended up looking like at IHOP. But in terms of Manifest Sons of God, that was never a term that would be used. Jim Jones kind of killed that one a little bit. We didn't ever. was talked about a little bit of like, it was this thing that happened a really long time ago, and you almost can't place it in history in your mind to realize like this was not that long ago. But how it mutated in the overall charismatic movement, I would say, is that it was like a generation of Joel's army. It was a generation of Elijah's, that we would have the ability to perform signs and wonders and control weather. And, recently one of the leaders out of IHOP, apparently said, control the moon. And that doesn't surprise me a bit because of the number of things that I have heard over the years. And so, you've got this group of people, and, there was the Sands of Time, Bob Jones prophecy, right? That, the best DNA was stored up, and that, it was born in my generation, and that we were going to, see, many things much greater than what, Jesus had ever done. And it's an interesting thing because there's a lot of pressure on people's lives, a lot of weirdness, but then you mix it with these ideas of a lot of works, a lot of fasting, a lot of prayer. And so people are hungry, tired, worn out, spending hours in this room, no windows, certain frequencies of music, certain decibels of music, hours and hours and hours. And the amount of folks that have come out of that, and of course you don't realize when you're in it, right? You're kind of trained. Everybody out there is bad and they're after us and they're after our mandate and our call. But when you get out, you look back and you realize that you were undergoing brain damage. Oh, yeah. And heart damage and life damage. And that this thing took the place of family. This thing took the place of anything resulting in normal. Of course, normal's bad, and isolated you from everything. And to the point where nothing is more important in these folks than keeping the fire burning on the altar, which is nonstop prayer and worship.
Oh, yeah. And even though it's evolved and has different names, the whole framework of Manifest Sons of God, like you said, Jim Jones kind of put a scar on that, but they took the same theology, the same framework, they morphed it. It became, I think it was the Southern Poverty Law is the one that exposed it as Joel's Army, and they traced it all the way back through William Branham. You can find the article online, but at that time it was made popular by another semi-crazy guy. I put him in the same category as Paul Cain, but the Todd Bentley character who was working with Mike Bickle at the same time. This was a nationally publicized movement. They wanted to create Joel's Army, but it was Manifested Sons of God, just rebranded, and not even a unique rebranding, because back in the late 40s, they called it Joel's Army at that time as well. So Paul Cain was instrumental in taking the key elements of latter rain, the ones that were the most destructive, and then carrying it forward, rebranding it, repackaging it, giving it to new leadership. For me, the most fascinating thing of all of this, you mentioned the Gnosticism, the spiritualism, the mysticism, all of these key elements you see. What's fascinating to me is that these men are claiming to be Christian, but they're picking and choosing these ideas that are clearly not, because they find them more appealing to the itching ears, and they'll mix it in with their sermons, where, in today's world, we have so much information. This is the information age. We could pick good guys with good sound theology and bring that forward. Why did they pick all of the bad guys, the people who are opposing Christianity? Why did they choose those?
I've done a lot of study into cult mind control, high control environments. And, there's a lot of science behind this thing actually, and what it does to the brain, and, dopamine and different chemicals released in your body, and to the point where it can become an addiction, these emotions, feelings, experiences. And so, when people leave these types of groups, they typically crash. I mean, first of all, most of these guys within IHOP just need a very long nap for a very long time, some sunshine, some food, some rest, but it's because you're withdrawing almost from this drug. And I think that there's a lot to be said in that, chasing down, when you start tasting Gnosticism, you get a hunger for those types of things, and you want to go deeper and deeper and deeper into secret knowledge, and there's more to be had. And There's just nothing practical that matters. Caring for the physical body, work, leaving a legacy. I mean, why leave a legacy if Jesus is coming back, any minute, kind of thing too. And so it's this whole lifestyle that gets wrapped up into it, and you can justify it, you can rationalize it, and you don't even realize till you're out of it that you lived in this swirl of arrested development. A lot of people that however long you've been in, that's probably the age you kind of stopped, growing at, if you will. And there's just a lot of work to be done. What is even sound? What's up? What's down? I mean, you almost have to a friend of mine has this, this visual of everything you own is out on the lawn in a giant yard sale, and you've got to oh no, we're keeping that, I guess we're keeping that. And, for us personally, we had to go back to Jesus, born of a virgin, lived a sinless life, was God, always has been God, died upon the cross, rose again. I mean, I was like, that's all I know for sure. And because we had gone from place to place to place, and again, they have their little, mutations, if you will, of what these things look like, but they're so darn similar that you began to question everything. You began to question Jesus. And what I really found at the end of the day is that is not Jesus that you have heard about. There are certainly, godly, wonderful human beings that love Jesus within innocence, within all of these worlds for sure. But the Gnosticism, the odd and strange things that are taught, the meanness of God, no, that's not Jesus.
No, they give it the name Jesus, but whatever it is that they're selling. In Branham's case, he said the angel was Jesus. So you've got the Jesus angel, and that's what they promoted. But whatever they're selling is not the Jesus of the Bible. I can assure you that. And, you're talking about the process after you leave a cult. That is really difficult, going through that. What do you keep? What do you leave? And I had this conversation recently with somebody. For those of us that were raised in it, there was a period of time in which your childhood is bliss, and you're raised and you're happy, and the cult is a happy thing, and you have friends, family, you love everything you love your life. And then there's this point of time in which you become fully indoctrinated and fully under the mind control. And I was just last week I had this conversation. You almost stop mental development at that point because your indoctrination has taken over your mind, your body. And whenever you leave, it's as though you're, for some people, they became that indoctrinated around age 16. Well, they act like a 16-year-old all of a sudden when they leave because that's what they've gone back to. The whole rest of that was cult identity. And when you remove it, you're left with a 16-year-old in an adult body. And now you have the challenge of, now I have to learn everything that everybody else has learned from age 16 to some people are, one guy that I was helping out, I think he was in his late 70s. So imagine that, from 16 to age 70. It's a lifetime, right? And then the most difficult thing, especially for those that stay Christian, is you learn it wasn't just that they taught you the wrong Jesus, but they taught you a different Bible. They taught you a different religion. And you have to deconstruct all of that. When you're done with the deconstruction process, now you have to reconstruct. And what do you reconstruct? Because every single thing that you knew could be false. And you have to weed out, what did they teach me that was wrong? Or what do I understand through the cult lens instead of what it actually says? It is such a challenge.
Well, it is the hardest work you will ever do. I think there's times that people will feel like they're crazy. I know I have at times. I think it's almost like, if you think about it again as a virus, it's in every cell of your body, every cell. You are infected, and you don't even realize that when you read the Bible, that you're seeing it through this fundamentalist, charismatic lens, and the stripping away of that of what does this really mean? What does this really say? What does this really mean about life? And then, you're dealing with all the things of during all that time, I wasn't building a resume. I have no marketable skills, if you will, and starting an entire life from scratch with complex trauma is something that's really daunting. I had no idea the number of bodies behind the bus in this situation, and I daily interface with a lot of these folks and have seen a ton of their stories. And of course, it's very much this thing of when people leave, there's a shunning, or just, we're too busy. This is our world. We don't have any grit or time for you. But they are viewed as, offensive, Jezebel, woke, all of these different things, regardless of what their beliefs are or where they have landed. There are plenty of people who have fully deconstructed their faith. And this may sound strange to you. I 100% understand it when people, the only thing they ever knew was that, you know what? I don't want it either. They are the most resilient, kind, giving people who have worked so hard in every area of their life to put their lives back together. I see them acting sometimes more Christian than Christians, raising funds for survivors and fighting for survivors and giving their voice to something. They've been crying out in the streets for a really long time and no one was listening. And so I've seen them put down their offenses towards, former leaders. They're still working through that because no one's hands are clean that we're leading in any capacity there to some extent or another, right? And work alongside of folks that maybe even hurt them for a common cause, knowing that at the end of the day, more people are going to be helped, saved, restored. So it's a really interesting situation, I guess, of culture of deconstructed folks, people that still hold on to their faith, sometimes very, folks that are very fresh out of this world that haven't even begun deprogramming, to see everybody coming together in this one voice and try to figure it out is unbelievable. And of course, many of the people that left this world years ago, they've been taking refugees, that have crawled out on their knees. This isn't their first rodeo helping people out. So, they're helping people with resumes and finding jobs. And it is the most beautiful community of people that is, very human at the same time.
Yeah, there's a lot of good in people and people helping people who have escaped, and it's an overwhelming task. So there needs to be a lot of people helping people, and it's a never-ending job if you're involved in it. So, well, this has been so much fun. If you had one thing that you could say to somebody who has been manipulated and indoctrinated to believe in a fictional stage persona, similar to what I came out of with Branhamism, it's the same exact framework, same exact religion. What would you say to people who have been under that type of spell?
Give it time. Don't join something else right away. Get a, spiritual trauma therapist as soon as you possibly can. Find some books, read, Overcoming Cult Mind Control is a really good one by Dr. Steve Hassan. I think one of the most helpful things for me was listening to your podcast, actually, because my brain was able to do the work specifically about Mike Bickle by unraveling the stage persona of who William Branham was. I could see so many similarities. Of course, it was a more sophisticated modern version of that. But the moment that the mask came off in terms of recognizing this man that even years after I left, I respected, cared for. I thought he was good. I thought he was confused, very dedicated, but I still had this level of respect for him because of his generosity, his very simple living on the outside, which is not at all true behind the scenes financially, right? According to, what folks are saying. But he lives in a duplex. He drives an old car. He wears Costco shirts and, old loafers. And he's extremely, he bought me a car once, and you live emotionally indebted towards the graciousness of this human being that lives this certain way. And suddenly you have to come to terms with the reality that maybe everything was actually a front. Maybe, just maybe, this person isn't as good as you were led to believe. And when that comes down and you are able to look around and recognize that every conversation, in my opinion, that I ever had with him was a grooming, leading presentation of what he wanted me to think about him, what he wanted me to think about other people, how he wanted me to react, how he was setting me up for the future. If I ever heard about a scandal, that I would have a story ready inside already. That when he made different moves with Jane Doe, I would be prepared that they're totally acceptable and not a problem. When that comes down, honestly, I think it's when the healing begins. It really is.
Absolutely. And it all comes down to this. If you can engage critical thought, you can avoid this type of thing happening to you. And in the mainstream churches that are healthy churches, you can find these websites that talk about the marks of a healthy church, how you can determine it's a healthy church. Well, even in a healthy church, turn on critical thought, because you don't know, it may be healthy at the time you and your family decide to start going there, but people are people and they have people problems, and you may get into a situation where it transitions to an unhealthy church. And as long as you're engaging critical thought, you can avoid all of the problems that go with this. But this has been so much fun. I'm so glad to have you on here and to talk about all of these things. Like I said, you've given me so much information that I'm still processing, that I think it will turn into either videos or pages on the website for weeks to come. And thank you so much for doing this.
Absolutely. I really appreciate you having me. John, thank you so much for all the work that you have done, and Charles and others. And just want you to know how much healing it's bringing to a community of people. We're passing this stuff around and the light bulbs are turning on. So I know it's a sacrifice of what you guys have done. I really want to say thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm glad it is helping people. If you've enjoyed our show and you want more information, you can check us out on the web. You can find us at william-branham.org. For an overview of the historical research of William Branham in the Healing Revivals, read Preacher Behind the White Hoods, a critical examination of William Branham and his message, available on Amazon, Kindle, and Audible.